The morning sun filtered through the towering Douglas firs as the Carter family pulled into the Pine Creek Campground, their silver Honda Pilot loaded with enough camping gear to last a week. It was July 15th, 2009, and what should have been the perfect summer getaway would soon become Oregon's most haunting, unsolved mystery. Emma and Eli Carter, identical twins who had just celebrated their 13th birthday, pressed their faces against the rear windows, their breath fogging the glass as they peered into the dense wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the campground's boundaries. Despite being twins, their personalities couldn't have been more different. Emma, with her wild curls barely contained by a purple headband, bounced in her seat with unbridled excitement, while Eli, methodical and observant, quietly studied the trail map he'd been clutching since they left Portland 3 hours earlier. "Mom, can we set up the tent by the creek?" Emma called out, already unbuckling her seatbelt before their father, David Carter, had even turned off the engine. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and even her usually reserved mother, Sarah, couldn't help but smile at her daughter's eagerness to explore. Before we dive deeper into this mystery that captivated the entire Pacific Northwest, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this story. It really helps the channel grow, and drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from all corners of the globe. Now let's continue with what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in Oregon's history. David Carter, a software engineer from Beaverton, had been planning this camping trip for months. Work stress had been mounting, and Sarah, a high school English teacher, had been pushing for quality family time before the twins started 8th grade. Pine Creek Campground seemed like the perfect escape. Remote enough to feel like a real wilderness experience, but developed enough to provide basic amenities and cell phone coverage, at least near the main facilities. "Remember what we discussed," Sarah said, turning in the passenger seat to face her children as David began unloading their gear. Her voice carried that particular tone parents use when they're trying to balance authority with understanding. "You two stick together? You don't wander off the marked trails, and you check in with us every hour? This isn't our backyard in Beaverton." Eli nodded solemnly, folding his trail map with precision. He'd already memorized the 3 main hiking trails that radiated out from the campground like spokes on a wheel. The Cascade Loop was the shortest at 2 miles, winding through old-growth forest before circling back to the main facilities. The Ridge Trail was more challenging, climbing steadily for 4 miles to a scenic overlook that promised breathtaking views of Mount Hood on clear days. The 3rd trail, simply marked as the Creek Trail, disappeared into the map's edge with a notation that it connected to the broader Pacific Crest Trail system, a detail that had captured Eli's imagination for weeks. Emma, meanwhile, had already spotted 2 other families with children and was practically vibrating with anticipation. She'd packed her beloved instant camera, determined to document every moment of their adventure. Her backpack bulged with film cartridges, a nature journal, colored pencils, and enough snacks to feed a small army. The campground bustled with typical summer activity. Site 17, where the Carters would spend what they believed would be a peaceful week, sat in a semicircle of similar sites, each offering just enough privacy while maintaining the communal feeling that made camping special. To their left, the Morrison family from Seattle had set up an elaborate base camp, complete with a screen shelter and camp kitchen that would make a Boy Scout jealous. To their right, a young couple from California shared knowing smiles as they struggled with their obviously new and unfamiliar tent. "Dad, the Morrison kids asked if Emma and I want to explore the creek after lunch," Eli announced, his usual caution tempered by the prospect of new friends and adventure. The Morrison children, Jake, 14, and his sister, Mia, 12, had been camping at Pine Creek for 3 consecutive summers and knew every hidden swimming hole and secret trail within 5 miles. David exchanged glances with Sarah, that silent parental communication that had developed over their 16 years of marriage. They'd already established ground rules during the 3-hour drive, but seeing their children's excitement made those rules feel simultaneously more important and more flexible. "As long as you're back by 4, Sarah decided, glancing at her watch. It was just past noon, giving them a reasonable window for exploration while ensuring they'd return well before dinner. "And remember, stay together, mark trails only, check in every hour," Emma and Eli recited in unison, their voices carrying the exaggerated patience that teenagers reserve for parental repetition. As the afternoon unfolded, the Pine Creek Campground settled into the lazy rhythm that defined perfect summer days. The Morrison and Carter families quickly bonded over shared meals and campfire stories, while other campers drifted in and out of conversations with the easy camaraderie that wilderness settings somehow encouraged. But by 4:15 p.m., when 4 children were supposed to return from their creek exploration, only Jake and Mia Morrison came running back to the campsite, their faces flushed with panic and their voices breaking as they delivered news that would shatter 2 families and launch one of the most intensive search operations in Oregon's history. Emma and Eli Carter had simply vanished. The golden afternoon light that had seemed so perfect just hours earlier now felt ominous as it slanted through the towering pines surrounding Pine Creek Campground. Sarah Carter stood frozen beside their silver Honda Pilot, her knuckles white as she gripped her cell phone, desperately hoping it would ring with news, any news, about her missing children. "They were right behind us," Jake Morrison repeated for the 4th time, his 14-year-old voice cracking with guilt and confusion. "I swear, Mr. Carter, they were right behind us when we crossed back over the creek." Emma was taking pictures of some weird fungus growing on a fallen log, and Eli was writing something in his notebook. "We waited for like 5 minutes, but then Mia got cold and wanted to come back, so I told them to catch up." David Carter knelt down to Jake's eye level, his software engineer's mind trying to process this information logically, even as panic clawed at his chest. "Show me exactly where you last saw them, son. Can you do that?" The creek trail, which had seemed like such an innocent adventure that morning, now stretched into the wilderness like a dark question mark. Park Ranger Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year veteran of the Oregon Park system, had arrived within minutes of David's frantic call to the ranger station. She'd seen enough family emergencies over the years to know the difference between kids who'd simply lost track of time and situations that required immediate action. "The thing about these woods," Ranger Walsh explained to the growing circle of concerned adults, her voice calm but serious, "is that they're deceptive. The main trails are well marked and safe, but there are dozens of old logging roads and game trails that can confuse even experienced hikers. Kids especially can get turned around without realizing how far they've wandered." By 6 p.m., what had started as a casual search by campground neighbors had escalated into a coordinated effort involving local law enforcement. Deputy Mark Rodriguez from the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office coordinated with Oregon State Police to establish a command post in the campground's main pavilion. The methodical process of organizing search teams, plotting grid patterns, and establishing communication protocols provided a sense of forward motion that helped combat the terrible helplessness that was settling over Emma and Eli's parents. Sarah had called her sister Margaret in Portland, who was already driving toward Pine Creek with a thermos of coffee and the kind of fierce determination that only family emergencies could summon. David's parents, retired from their farm in eastern Oregon, were making the 4-hour drive, despite their 70-plus years, unwilling to sit idle while their grandchildren were missing. "The first 24 hours are crucial," Deputy Rodriguez explained to the assembled searchers, his flashlight beam cutting through the gathering dusk. "But I want to be clear about something. These are smart kids, according to their parents, and they've got basic camping knowledge. The weather is warm, they're not dressed inappropriately, and there's plenty of fresh water in this area. We're treating this as a search and rescue operation, not a recovery." The search teams were methodically organized. Team 1, led by Ranger Walsh, would focus on the creek trail itself, following the path Jake Morrison had described and looking for any sign the twins had deviated from the marked route. Team 2, composed of local volunteers with wilderness experience, would cover the ridge trail on the possibility that the children had become confused and taken a wrong turn. Team 3 would systematically check the Cascade Loop and all connecting trails within a 2-mile radius of the campground. As darkness fell over Pine Creek, the searchers' flashlight beams began to flicker through the forest like fireflies, each beam representing hope and determination. The temperature was dropping into the 50s, comfortable enough for anyone properly dressed, but concerning for children who might be lost, scared, and unprepared for a night in the wilderness. Margaret Chen, Sarah's younger sister, arrived at the campground just as the organized search was expanding to include dogs from the Portland Search and Rescue Unit. She found her sister sitting on a picnic table, staring into the forest as if she could will her children to materialize from the shadows. "Any word?" Margaret asked, though Sarah's expression had already answered the question. "Nothing. It's like they just disappeared." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Emma had her camera. Eli had his notebook and compass. They're responsible kids, Maggie. They wouldn't just wander off without telling someone. Jake Morrison, who had refused to leave the command post despite his parents' gentle suggestions that he try to get some rest, overheard Sarah's comment. He approached hesitantly, his young face etched with the kind of guilt that adults recognize as misplaced, but children carry as absolute truth. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "there's something else I remembered. When Emma was taking pictures of that fungus, she kept saying something was weird about it, like it was growing in a perfect circle or something. And Eli was really interested in his compass. He kept checking it and frowning like something was wrong." This new information sent a ripple of renewed energy through the search teams. Ranger Walsh radioed the detail to all units, adding it to the growing profile of the twins' last known activities. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could be the key that unlocked the mystery of Emma and Eli's disappearance. As midnight approached, the official search was suspended until dawn, though several volunteer teams continued working through the night using headlamps and thermal imaging equipment donated by a local outdoors company. The Morrisons had offered to share their large screen shelter with the Carter family, creating an impromptu base of operations where coffee stayed hot and hope burned as bright as the camp lanterns. David Carter stood at the edge of the campsite, his gaze fixed on the dark tree line where his children had vanished. Tomorrow would bring more searchers, more equipment, and more systematic coverage of the vast wilderness surrounding Pine Creek. But tonight, in the terrible quiet between one day and the next, he could only stand watch and pray that somewhere in those dark woods, Emma and Eli were safe, together, and waiting for morning. Dawn broke cold and grey over Pine Creek Campground on July 17, 2009, casting long shadows through the Douglas firs that seemed to mock the previous day's desperate search efforts. Sarah Carter hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, and stood watching the sunrise with hollow eyes and a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago in her trembling hands. The search for Emma and Eli had expanded exponentially overnight. FBI agents from the Portland field office had arrived at 3 a.m., transforming the campground pavilion into a sophisticated command center complete with topographical maps, communication equipment, and the kind of methodical documentation that turned personal tragedy into official case files. Special Agent Lisa Hendricks, a specialist in child abduction cases, had immediately begun the delicate process of interviewing family members, friends, and anyone who might have interacted with the twins. "Mrs. Carter, I know this is difficult, but I need you to think carefully about the days leading up to this camping trip," Agent Hendricks said, her voice professionally gentle but persistent. Had Emma or Eli mentioned meeting anyone new? Online friends? Someone from school? Anyone who might have shown unusual interest in their activities? Sarah shook her head, her exhaustion making even simple questions feel overwhelming. They're good kids. They don't talk to strangers online. They don't have social media accounts yet. We've been very careful about that. Their friends are all kids from school or our neighborhood. Everyone knows them. The search dogs had arrived at first light, German shepherds and bloodhounds, whose handlers spoke in the quiet, confident tones of professionals who'd worked hundreds of similar cases. The dogs picked up the twins' scent immediately at the creek trail entrance, following it for nearly a mile before losing it completely at a rocky outcropping where the creek curved sharply east toward the deeper wilderness. It's not unusual for scent trails to disappear near water, explained handler Tom Muller, kneeling beside his German shepherd ranger, who whined softly and circled the area where the trail had gone cold. But what's odd is how abruptly it stops. Usually we get some indication of direction, some scattered scent markers. This is like they just vanished. Meanwhile, Team 3 had made the search's first significant discovery. Following Jake Morrison's description of Emma's interest in the unusual fungus growth, searchers had located the fallen log he'd described, approximately 3/4 of a mile down the creek trail. The scene told a story that both encouraged and troubled the investigators. Emma's instant camera lay partially buried under a thin layer of fallen leaves, its bright yellow case immediately recognizable to anyone who knew her passion for photography. More significantly, the last photo she'd taken was still visible in the camera's small preview window, a close-up shot of what appeared to be fairy ring mushrooms growing in an almost perfect circle around the base of the fallen log. The camera wasn't dropped, observed Deputy Rodriguez, carefully bagging the evidence. Look at how it's positioned, covered with leaves but protected from moisture. This was placed here deliberately. Eli's compass was found 20 feet away, its metal case scratched but functional. When searchers checked its accuracy, they discovered something disturbing. The compass was off by nearly 30 degrees, its needle pointing consistently northeast instead of north. Local geologists were consulted, but initial tests showed no magnetic anomalies in the area that could explain the compass malfunction. The discovery of these personal items energized the search teams but raised more questions than answers. Why would the twins abandon their most treasured possessions? Had they left them as markers, hoping someone would find them? Or had something happened that forced them to drop their belongings and flee? By noon, on July 17th, the search had expanded to include helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras, volunteer teams from 3 counties, and specialized technical rescue units capable of accessing the area's most remote and dangerous terrain. The Pacific Crest Trail, which intersected with local trails about 5 miles from the campground, became a particular focus as searchers considered the possibility that the twins had wandered onto this major hiking route and been picked up by thru-hikers or others. Dr. William Hayes, a child psychologist consulted by the FBI, offered insights that both comforted and concerned the search teams. 13-year-olds, especially intelligent ones like Emma and Eli appear to have a strong survival instinct and good problem-solving abilities, he explained to Agent Hendricks. If they're lost but uninjured, they're likely to seek shelter, stay near water sources, and try to signal for help. However, if they encountered someone with harmful intentions, their trusting nature could work against them. The media attention began on the second day, with local news crews arriving to document what was quickly becoming one of the largest search operations in Oregon's recent history. Sarah and David Carter, thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, made their first public appeal for information during a press conference held in the campground's main clearing. Emma and Eli are smart, responsible children who know better than to wander off alone, David said, his voice steady despite the obvious strain. "If you've seen them, if you have any information at all, please contact the authorities immediately. We just want our kids to come home." The press conference generated hundreds of tips from across the region. Claimed sightings placed the twins everywhere from Portland to the California border, creating a logistical nightmare for investigators who had to follow up on each potential lead while continuing the intensive ground search around Pine Creek. One tip, however, stood out from the others. A gas station attendant in the small town of Estacada, about 40 miles northwest of the campground, reported seeing two children matching Emma and Eli's description on the morning of July 16th, the day after they disappeared. The children had been with an adult male, possibly in his 40s, who'd paid cash for gas and snacks while the kids waited in a blue sedan. The man kept looking around nervous-like, the attendant, Maria Santos, told investigators, and the kids, they looked tired, maybe scared. The girl kept trying to get my attention, but the man hurried them back to the car before I could really talk to them. This potential sighting shifted the investigation's focus dramatically. If Emma and Eli had been taken from the campground by someone they'd encountered in the woods, the case had evolved from a search and rescue operation to a possible kidnapping. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team was activated, bringing additional resources and expertise to what was now being treated as a federal investigation. As the third day of searching began, the command post at Pine Creek had evolved into a small temporary city. Media trucks, search and rescue vehicles, law enforcement units from multiple agencies, and hundreds of volunteers created a constant hum of activity that stood in stark contrast to the peaceful wilderness setting where Emma and Eli had simply vanished without explanation. But despite all the resources, all the technology, and all the dedicated people working around the clock, the twins remained missing. Each passing hour made their safe return statistically less likely, a fact that everyone understood but no one wanted to voice aloud. In the deep woods surrounding Pine Creek, the Douglas firs kept their secrets, and Emma and Eli Carter seemed to have disappeared as completely as if they'd never existed at all. 3 weeks had passed since Emma and Eli Carter vanished from Pine Creek Campground, and the massive search operation that had dominated the Oregon wilderness was slowly scaling back to a core team of investigators and persistent volunteers. The command post that had bustled with hundreds of searchers now felt eerily quiet, populated mainly by FBI agents, local law enforcement, and family members who refused to abandon hope. Agent Lisa Hendricks sat in the converted pavilion, surrounded by evidence boards covered with photos, timeline charts, and maps marked with hundreds of colored pins representing everything from confirmed sightings to anonymous tips. The investigation had evolved far beyond a simple missing persons case, encompassing potential abduction scenarios, extensive background checks, and a growing database of information that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Let's review what we know for certain," Agent Hendricks said to the assembled team, her voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks' worth of sleepless nights and false leads. Emma and Eli Carter left their campsite with the Morrison children at approximately 1:30 p.m. on July 15th. They were last definitively seen by Jake Morrison at 2:45 p.m. near the creek crossing, approximately 3/4 of a mile from the campground. Their personal items, Emma's camera and Eli's compass, were discovered at a location consistent with Jake's description, but positioned in a way that suggests deliberate placement rather than accidental dropping. Deputy Rodriguez, who had become the local law enforcement liaison for the case, added his perspective from 3 weeks of intensive ground investigation. "We've covered over 200 square miles of wilderness with search teams, dogs, helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar. We've followed up on 847 tips from the public, including 23 claimed sightings of the children. The Estacada gas station sighting remains our most credible lead, but despite extensive investigation, we haven't been able to identify the adult male or the blue sedan. The Estacada lead had consumed enormous resources without yielding concrete results. Traffic cameras from surrounding areas had been analyzed frame by frame, but the rural location meant limited surveillance coverage. The gas station's security system had malfunctioned on July 16th, a coincidence that investigators found suspicious but couldn't prove was related to the twins' disappearance. Sarah Carter had aged visibly in the 3 weeks since her children vanished. She spent most days at the command post, organizing volunteer efforts and maintaining detailed logs of every tip and lead. Her systematic approach to the crisis reflected her background as an English teacher, but also served as a coping mechanism that kept her functional when grief threatened to overwhelm her completely. "There's something we're missing," Sarah said quietly, studying the evidence board with the intense focus that had become her constant expression. "Emma and Eli are smart kids. If they could leave us clues, they would. That camera and compass weren't abandoned. They were placed. But what were they trying to tell us?" Dr. William Hayes, the child psychologist who'd been consulting on the case, had developed a theory that was both encouraging and troubling. If the twins were taken by someone, their behavior suggests they remained calm and rational enough to attempt communication through the positioning of their belongings. This indicates they weren't in immediate physical danger at that point. However, it also suggests they recognized they were in a situation requiring help. Otherwise, why leave the items behind? The investigation had expanded to include extensive background checks on every adult who'd been at Pine Creek Campground during the relevant time period. The Morrison family, despite being the last people to see Emma and Eli, had been thoroughly investigated and cleared. Their grief and cooperation were genuine, and their timeline was corroborated by multiple witnesses and electronic records. More concerning were several individuals who'd been camping in the area but left immediately after the twins' disappearance was reported. A man registered under the name John Smith, almost certainly an alias, had checked out of Site 23 at 11 p.m. on July 15th, claiming a family emergency. His credit card was traced to a deceased person in Nevada, and surveillance footage from the campground entrance showed a figure whose face was consistently obscured by a baseball cap and whose license plate was illegible due to mud or deliberate obstruction. John Smith had paid his camping fees in cash and interacted minimally with other campers, behavior that hadn't seemed unusual at the time but now appeared suspicious in retrospect. The campground host, elderly retired teacher Harold Chen, remembered the man as quiet and polite, but couldn't provide any detailed physical description beyond average height, maybe 40 or 50 years old. Another person of interest was a day hiker who'd been seen on the creek trail multiple times during the weeks leading up to the twins' disappearance. Several witnesses described a middle-aged man with a professional camera who claimed to be photographing local wildlife. He'd been particularly interested in the area where Emma and Eli's belongings were later found, asking detailed questions about trail access and camping regulations. "Wildlife photographers aren't uncommon in this area," Ranger Walsh explained, but this individual's behavior pattern was unusual. Most serious photographers work early morning or late afternoon for optimal lighting. This man was consistently present during midday hours when wildlife activity is minimal. Indeed, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had developed a preliminary profile of a potential suspect, assuming the twins had been abducted rather than lost in the wilderness. The profile described an organized individual, possibly with outdoor experience, who had likely observed the family prior to approaching the children. The calculated timing of the approach, during a period when the twins were separated from adult supervision, but still close enough to campground facilities to avoid detection, suggested someone familiar with the area and experienced in manipulating children. "We're looking for someone who presented himself as trustworthy," explained Agent Sarah Kim from the BAU. "Possibly someone who claimed to need help, offered to show the twins something interesting, or presented himself as an authority figure." Emma and Eli were cautious children, according to their parents, so whoever approached them was skilled at gaining their trust quickly. As July turned to August, the media attention began to shift toward other stories, but the Carter family refused to let their children's disappearance fade from public consciousness. David had taken indefinite leave from his software engineering job, dedicating himself full-time to organizing search efforts and maintaining the case's visibility through social media and local news appearances. Margaret Chen, Sarah's sister, had essentially moved to Pine Creek, coordinating volunteer efforts and managing the logistics of feeding and housing the searchers who continued arriving from across the Pacific Northwest. The campground had become an unlikely community united by shared purpose and growing frustration with the lack of concrete progress. "It's been a month," David said during his nightly call to his parents in eastern Oregon, his voice hollow with exhaustion and suppressed emotion. "How does two kids just disappear without a trace? In this age of cell phones and GPS and surveillance cameras everywhere, how is that possible?" But Emma and Eli Carter had indeed disappeared completely, leaving behind only questions, scattered personal belongings, and a family whose faith in the world's fundamental safety had been shattered in the space of a single afternoon. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of Oregon, or perhaps far from it by now, 13-year-old twins were either surviving against impossible odds or had become victims of something too terrible for their parents to contemplate. The investigation continued, methodical and persistent, but as summer progressed toward fall, hope began to transform into something harder and more bitter, the terrible certainty that Emma and Eli Carter were gone, and the even more terrible uncertainty of whether they would ever be found. By the summer of 2015, 6 years had passed since Emma and Eli Carter disappeared from Pine Creek Campground, and the case had settled into the cold file archives of the FBI's Portland field office. The massive search operation that had once transformed the peaceful campground into a temporary city was now just a memory, marked by a small memorial plaque near the creek trail entrance, and the occasional bouquet of wildflowers left by hikers who remembered the story. Agent Lisa Hendricks, now promoted to supervisory special agent, still carried the Carter case as one of her most haunting unsolved investigations. The twins' photos remained pinned to her office wall alongside dozens of other missing children, but Emma and Eli's faces seemed to follow her with particular intensity. Two 13-year-olds frozen in time while the world moved on around their absence. "Every few months, something comes up," Agent Hendricks explained to her newest team member, Agent Marcus Thompson, as they reviewed cold cases for potential new leads. "A hiker finds some old camping gear. Someone claims to recognize them in a crowd. A psychic calls with a vision. We follow up on everything, but after 6 years..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, the implied hopelessness speaking louder than any words. The Carters had never stopped searching. David and Sarah's marriage had survived the unthinkable stress of losing their children, perhaps because they'd channeled their grief into relentless action rather than letting it consume them from within. They'd established the Emma and Eli Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing children and funding search and rescue operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Sarah had returned to teaching, but her classroom was now filled with photos and posters of missing children from across the region. She'd become an informal expert on missing persons cases, consulting with law enforcement agencies and families facing their own nightmarish situations. Her students knew her story, and many had volunteered for search operations during summer breaks, turning tragedy into education and education into hope. David had left his software engineering career entirely, using his technical skills to maintain databases of missing persons information and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. He'd developed search grid applications that were now used by rescue organizations across the country, transforming his desperate need to find his own children into tools that might help other families avoid similar tragedy. The Pine Creek area itself had changed in subtle ways. The campground still operated normally, but staff members were trained in missing persons protocols and new safety measures had been implemented. Trail markers were more frequent and visible. Communication equipment was strategically placed along popular routes, and the ranger station maintained 24-hour contact capabilities with local law enforcement. Jake Morrison, now 20 years old and studying forestry at Oregon State University, made an annual pilgrimage to Pine Creek every July 15th. The guilt he'd carried as a 14-year-old had evolved into a lifelong commitment to wilderness safety and search and rescue work. He'd joined the university's search and rescue team as a freshman and had participated in dozens of operations throughout the Cascade Range. "I think about them every day," Jake confided to his girlfriend Elena during his 2015 visit to the memorial plaque. Emma with her camera, always looking for something interesting to photograph. Eli with his compass and notebooks, treating every hike like a scientific expedition. They should be 18 now, graduating from high school, making plans for college. Instead, the investigation had never officially closed, but active leads had dwindled to almost nothing. The mysterious John Smith, who'd left the campground on the night of the disappearance, had never been identified, despite ongoing efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies. The Estacada gas station sighting remained the most credible potential lead, but 6 years of investigation had failed to produce any corroborating evidence. Periodically, new technologies would prompt fresh examinations of the existing evidence. In 2012, enhanced DNA analysis had been performed on trace materials found at the scene where the twins' belongings were discovered, but the results were inconclusive. In 2014, improved facial recognition software had been used to analyze thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the days surrounding the disappearance, but no definitive matches were identified. The case had also attracted attention from amateur investigators and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. Reddit forums and Facebook groups regularly discuss theories about what might have happened to Emma and Eli, generating both helpful tips and frustrating misinformation. The Carter family appreciated the continued public interest, but had learned to filter the genuine leads from the well-meaning but unhelpful speculation. The hardest part, Sarah reflected during a 2015 interview with a local news station on the 6th anniversary of the disappearance, is not knowing. If someone took them, are they still alive somewhere? Are they being held against their will? Have they forgotten us? Or did something happen in those woods that we've never been able to discover? The not knowing is what keeps you awake at night. Dr. William Hayes, the child psychologist who'd consulted on the original investigation, had followed the case's long-term impact on the family and community. His research on prolonged ambiguous loss, grief without closure, had been significantly influenced by his work with the Carters and other families of missing persons. What's remarkable about David and Sarah is how they've transformed their personal tragedy into systematic action, Dr. Hayes observed in his clinical notes. Rather than being paralyzed by uncertainty, they've created meaning through helping others. It's a coping mechanism that's allowed them to function while maintaining hope. Margaret Chen, Sarah's sister, had become the unofficial coordinator of the ongoing volunteer network that continued to organize periodic searches and maintain the case's visibility. Every summer, Groups of volunteers would spend weekends systematically searching areas of wilderness that hadn't been covered during the initial intensive operation. These searches rarely produced significant evidence, but they served the important psychological function of maintaining active engagement with the case. "We'll never stop looking," Margaret declared during a volunteer coordination meeting in the summer of 2015. "As long as there are places we haven't searched, as long as there are questions we haven't answered, we'll keep looking. Emma and Eli are out there somewhere, and they deserve to be found." The local community had never forgotten the twins either. Estacada, the small town where the gas station sighting had occurred, had installed missing persons awareness signs throughout the downtown area. Pine Creek Campground held an annual Safety Awareness Day each July, combining memorial services with educational programs about wilderness safety and missing persons prevention. But as 2015 progressed toward 2016, even the most optimistic supporters had to acknowledge that the chances of finding Emma and Eli alive were becoming increasingly remote. 7 years was a long time in missing persons cases, especially involving children. Hope hadn't died, but it had changed, becoming something more abstract and patient, focused on eventual answers rather than immediate rescue. The case files remained open, the photos stayed on Agent Hendrick's wall, and somewhere in the vast Pacific Northwest wilderness, the secret of what happened to Emma and Eli Carter on that July afternoon in 2009 waited to be discovered. Time had transformed the urgent search into a persistent investigation, the desperate hope into patient determination, and the Carter twins into symbols of all the missing children whose stories remain unfinished. 7 years of silence stretched between that terrible afternoon at Pine Creek and the present, but the silence was about to be broken in the most unexpected way possible. 15 years had passed since Emma and Eli Carter disappeared into the Oregon wilderness, and the case had become one of those tragic mysteries that older residents of the Pacific Northwest would mention to newcomers, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable dangers that could lurk even in familiar places. It was now July 2024, and what had once been front-page news was remembered mainly in online forums and cold case databases. Marcus Rivera was exactly the kind of person who might remember such stories. A 34-year-old environmental scientist from Portland, he spent most weekends exploring the Cascade Range, combining his love of solitude with his professional interest in forest ecosystem recovery. He'd been hiking alone for over a decade, often venturing into remote areas that casual day hikers avoided. Armed with GPS units, emergency beacons, and the kind of careful preparation that comes from understanding just how quickly wilderness situations can turn dangerous. On July 20th, 2024, Marcus was following an unmarked game trail approximately 8 miles northeast of Pine Creek Campground, in a section of old-growth forest that had been logged in the 1970s and was now recovering its natural character. He was documenting the return of native plant species when he noticed something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. A metallic glint barely visible beneath decades of accumulated forest debris. The object was buried under layers of pine needles, moss, and decomposing leaves, suggesting it had been there for years. Marcus initially assumed it was probably a piece of old logging equipment, or perhaps camping gear left behind by careless hikers. But something about its size and shape made him curious enough to clear away the organic matter and investigate further. What he uncovered was a small, rusted cooler, the kind that families typically used for day trips or camping excursions. The metal handle had corroded badly, and the latches were seized with rust, but the cooler itself appeared to be intact. Most importantly, it had been deliberately buried, covered with rocks and branches in a way that suggested someone had worked to conceal it. Marcus's scientific training had taught him to be methodical in his observations. He photographed the cooler in its original position, documented its GPS coordinates, and carefully examined the surrounding area for any other signs of human activity. The burial site was in a small depression between two large Douglas firs, perhaps 50 feet from the game trail and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't actively searching the area. When Marcus finally managed to force open the corroded latches, what he found inside made his hands shake and his breath catch in his throat. The cooler contained items that were clearly personal belongings, carefully wrapped in plastic bags that had protected them from moisture and decay over the years. There was a purple headband, still bright despite its age, a small notebook with a compass symbol drawn on the cover, a collection of instant photographs showing forest scenes and camping activities. But it was the final item that made Marcus immediately understand the significance of his discovery. Wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and protected by what appeared to be a small waterproof container was a handwritten note, the paper yellow with age but the words still clearly legible in a careful, childish script. If someone finds this, our names are Emma and Eli Carter. We are 13 years old, and we disappeared from Pine Creek Campground on July 15, 2009. The man who took us said his name was Uncle Pete, but that's not his real name. He has a blue car and a cabin somewhere north of the campground. Emma is hurt and can't walk very far. We tried to leave clues so Mom and Dad would find us. Please tell them we love them, and we tried to come home. Please help us. Emma and Eli Carter, July 18, 2009. Marcus sat in the forest for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the note and trying to process what he'd discovered. He'd found a 15-year-old message in a bottle buried in the wilderness by two missing children who had somehow managed to leave behind evidence of their abduction. The implications were staggering. Emma and Eli Carter hadn't simply gotten lost in the woods. They had been taken by someone, and they'd been alive at least 3 days after their disappearance. Following proper protocol for such a discovery, Marcus immediately contacted local law enforcement using his satellite communicator. Within 2 hours, the remote forest location was crawling with investigators, including Agent Lisa Hendricks, who had retired from the FBI but remained involved in the case as a consultant, and Deputy Rodriguez, now Sheriff Rodriguez, who had never forgotten the missing twins. 15 years, Agent Hendricks said softly, kneeling beside the opened cooler and studying its contents through clear evidence bags. They were alive for at least 3 days after they disappeared. They had time to write this note, to collect these items, to bury this cooler. That changes everything we thought we knew about this case. The discovery site was immediately treated as a crime scene, with evidence technicians photographing and documenting every detail. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to search for any additional buried materials in the surrounding area. The note itself was rushed to FBI laboratories for handwriting analysis, though Agent Hendricks was already confident it was genuine. The writing matched samples from the twins' school notebooks, and the details included information that had never been released to the public. Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated the immediate response, while agents began the process of reopening and re-examining every aspect of the original investigation. The reference to Uncle Pete and a blue car matches elements from our Estacada gas station sighting, he noted, reviewing files that he'd maintained in active status despite the case's cold classification. This note confirms that the twins were abducted, and it provides us with specific details about their abductor. The items in the cooler told a heartbreaking story of 2 children who had maintained hope and presence of mind even while being held against their will. Emma's photographs included images from their family camping trip, but also several shots that appeared to have been taken after their disappearance, blurry images of a wooden interior, possibly a cabin, and what looked like a partial view of a license plate. Eli's notebook contained not only the desperate note, but also detailed observations about their surroundings, including estimates of travel time from the campground. descriptions of terrain, and even crude maps of areas they'd been taken to. His scientific approach to documenting their situation had created a trail of evidence that investigators were now analyzing with 15 years of hindsight and advanced forensic techniques. "These kids were remarkable," said Dr. Hayes, now in his 70s, but still sharp and still consulting on missing persons cases. Even in a terrifying situation, they maintained enough composure to document their experiences and create this cache of evidence. They knew that their best chance of rescue might come from someone finding these materials long after they'd left the area. The discovery had immediate implications for the investigation's direction. The reference to a cabin north of the campground prompted a systematic review of property records and satellite imagery for the relevant time period. The description of Uncle Pete was compared against databases of known child predators and individuals who might have had access to the Pine Creek area in 2009. Most significantly, Emma's photographs were being analyzed with digital enhancement techniques that hadn't existed in 2009. The partial license plate image, though blurry and aged, was being processed by specialists who hoped to extract enough detail to identify the vehicle. The interior shots of what appeared to be a cabin were being compared against real estate records and construction databases to potentially identify the location where the twins had been held. David and Sarah Carter, now in their 50s and still active in missing persons advocacy, were notified of the discovery within hours. The phone call they'd hoped for but never expected to receive came from Agent Hendricks personally, delivered with the careful balance of renewed hope and realistic caution that such situations demanded. "We found evidence that Emma and Eli were alive after their disappearance," Agent Hendricks explained, her voice thick with emotion after 15 years of carrying this case. "They left us messages. They tried to come home. We're going to find out what happened to them." As news of the discovery spread through the law enforcement community and eventually to the media, the long-dormant investigation roared back to life with resources and technologies that hadn't been available in 2009. 15 years of silence had ended, with the voices of two missing children reaching across time through a rusted cooler buried in the Oregon wilderness. And their message was clear. We were here, we were taken, and we never stopped trying to come home. The hunt for Uncle Pete and the truth about what happened to Emma and Eli Carter had begun again, armed with clues that the twins themselves had left behind in a desperate act of hope and determination that had waited 15 years to be discovered. The story of Emma and Eli Carter continues as investigators race to follow the trail of evidence the twins left behind, hoping that after 15 years, justice might finally be served and two missing children might finally be brought home.